Bienvenue à tous. Welcome everyone to the second day of the Virtual Term Limits Conference 2020 in retrospective. My name is Sofia Mostrup. I'm the Deputy Director for Central and West Africa at NDI. And it's my pleasure to provide you with a short summary of yesterday's proceedings before introducing today's panel. If you're interested, you can follow a full recording of the proceedings of yesterday through the virtual page of the conference, both in English and in French. And if you're watching today's live stream from that web page, you can actually toggle between English and French depending on your language of preference. Similarly, we have Facebook live streaming in both French and English, and we will cross-reference the two Facebook pages in the comments section. So there should be ample opportunity to follow today and also to check in on what was said yesterday, where we had really a great first day of exchanges. We heard first welcoming remarks from Dr. Christopher Muñoz, our Senior Associate for Africa at NDI, and also from NDI President, Ambassador Derek Mitchell, who both reminded us that this week's event is a follow-on to last year's highly successful conference in Niamey on presidential term limits. It was held in October of last year. And unfortunately, this year, we cannot meet in person as we did last year due to the COVID pandemic. But as Chris said, while this is of course unfortunate that we cannot meet again in person, the silver lining is that we at least get to expand participation by doing a virtual event. And we already had more than 900 views yesterday. So it's wonderful to see so many people tuning in. Derek and Chris yesterday thanked our co-organizers, and I definitely want to join my voice to the chorus of thanks to the Africa Forum, the Open Society Initiative, for West Africa, OSIWA, and for Southern Africa, OSISA, as well as the Kofi Annan Institute, who worked with us last year and again this year to make this conference a success. And I also want to give a huge thank you to our civil society partners, the Katiba Institute, Tournons la Page, and Africtivist, whom we will be hearing more from today. As Derek said yesterday, over the past year, we have seen a growing pattern of modifying or eliminating term limits that, if it continues, will carry far-reaching consequences for African governance, stability, and development. So this gathering is very timely as it allows us to review the state of affairs 1 year after the Niamey conference and also to recommit ourselves to action. After Derek's remarks yesterday, we had a wonderful performance from the Ivorian Slamactivist musical group with the catching refrain, "Ne casse pas le flambeau, passe-le," meaning don't break the torch by overstaying in power, pass it on to the next generation. And we'll look forward to hearing more from them tomorrow. The keynote remarks yesterday were given by Professor Yash Gai, the director of the Katiba Institute, who provided a wonderful historical overview of term limits on the continent and of the state of affairs today. And Professor Gai notably stated that if term limits were fixed in stone, leaders could focus more on delivering to their people rather than trying to change the constitution. In terms of yesterday's panel, it was perfectly moderated by Ichumile Gada from OSISA, and she led the panelists through a thought-provoking discussion on why term limits matter. We heard during that panel from Dr. Boniface Doulani of Afrobarometer, who shared data from Afrobarometer surveys showing that more than 3/4 of Africans support term limits, including in countries where such limits have been removed. He also noted that in countries where there is regular executive turnover, citizens are more likely to turn out to vote. So term limits contribute to greater citizen engagement and also to greater citizen participation in elections and politics. Her Excellency former Prime Minister Aminata Touré argued forcefully that term limits contribute to political stability and thereby facilitate economic development, and that youth in particular can play a key role in upholding the respect for term limits. NDI Country Director Arnold Zunga emphasized the need for term limits plus, meaning that term limits are necessary but not sufficient to protect democratic gains. We also need credible elections, respect for human rights, and accountable governance. Finally, Dr. Adem Abebe, among other important points, emphasized the role of political parties in upholding term limits and the challenge in translating public opinion into policy. The panel was followed by a rich set of questions and answers, and I really do encourage everyone to watch the recording of the discussion if you can. So now for today, it's my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Ms. Idayat Hassan, who is the director of the highly respected Center for Democracy and Development, CDD, which is an Abuja-based think tank that focuses on deepening democracy and development in West Africa. Prior to joining CDD, Ms. Hassan was a deputy regional coordinator with the movement against corruption that seeks to eradicate corruption and poverty in Nigeria. Ms. Hassan is a lawyer by profession, and her work spans issues relating to democracy, accountability, peace and security, as well as transitional justice in West Africa. So I really cannot imagine a better person to lead today's panel on building popular support for term limits, a panel which will discuss strategies that civil society groups have used to respond to developments over the past year. And you will see that the panel picks up nicely from where we left off the conversation yesterday. Before passing the floor to Idayat, I just want to really encourage everyone to participate actively with questions to enrich the conversation. You can share your questions via the Term Limits Initiative.org website or in the Facebook comment sections or even on Twitter if you want. So thank you very much, and over to you, Idayat.
Thank you very much. And it's a very good afternoon, colleagues and friends. And it's a very good time to actually be having this discussion, considering that for us in West Africa, the last few months has actually been quite interesting, particularly October, actually, for the whole of Africa itself. So you are welcome to this discussion, and I'm sure that it will be quite interesting because we have very formidable panelists who have been involved in one process or the other in terms of addressing term limits on this panel. It's interesting to note that in today's Africa, 8 countries have head of states who have been in power for over 2 decades. And 2 of those 3 leaders, Paul Biya in Cameroon, Theodore Obiang in Equatorial Guinea, and Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, have ruled for 3 decades. That's like a total of 30 years on a continent with a median age of about 19 years. This means that millions of Africans have never experienced a constitutional transition of power or a popularly elected and effective president. Post-independence Africa has gained infamy for repeatedly producing lavish, unaccountable dictators who disregard or co-opt the constitution, democratic institution, and the rule of law. These entrenched leaders have made unremarkable impacts on their countries. Seemingly, there is actually nothing to show for their indefinite tenure, and I'll try to adduce evidence to this later on. In the worst cases, as in Uganda and Eritrea, we've had 6 type leaders who have steered nations otherwise brimming with potential into social, political, and economic unrest. Human rights abuses of journalists, political rivals, and everyday citizens orchestrated by Afwaki, Museveni, and others are well documented. Citizens this nation live in perpetual fear of the state. In between, they have a corrupt court system and a politicized police force, which all compound poverty, the lack of infrastructures in our countries. As recently as 2011, one African dictator vowed to rule his economically ravaged country for 1 billion years, if God wills. Thankfully, former President Yahya Jammeh, the author of those remarks, has since been ousted. However, what is actually alarming is the way leaders are beginning to retain power by nominally rewriting a democratic constitution. Several African leaders have tinkered with the constitution to elongate their tenure. Across the continent, we have at least 18 head of states that have actually attempted a constitutional amendment. In 2016 alone, in West Africa, we had at least 6 leaders who were tinkering with the constitution just to benefit themselves. At the beginning of this year, we saw some of those tinkering beginning to bear fruit with the election of Togo's President Eyadema, who finally changed the constitution to include term limits. But of course, all the previous years that he has used is now turned into 0, because as we say, a law do not have retroactive effects. He contested the elections for the 4th time and he actually won. Unfortunately, his success has since spurred other leaders in the region to pursue additional terms. In Guinea-Conakry, Alpha Condé rushed through a constitutional amendment and a referendum during the COVID-19 pandemic. This legalized his bid for a 3rd term and his subsequent electoral victory. But I think what is very interesting with the Condé Guinea-Conakry amendment is like at least 12 of the clauses on which citizens voted were completely different when they got the new constitution. In the same vein, President Alassane Ouattara ran on an amendment he had previously inserted into the constitution, and today he has won the same election. Just yesterday, we had the swearing-in bid in Guinea-Conakry. These bids of constitutional coup d'etat, like I love to call it, is incredibly worrying, as each success grows the likelihood of a continent-wide bandwagon effect. And importantly, constitutional amendments do have far-reaching implications for the country and our citizens. A 3rd term affects the economy and may lead to grave violence within the country. A quick look at the per capita income reveals that most of these countries have the lowest on the continent. So a quick look at 10 of those countries, for instance, reveals that Uganda has a per capita income of just $647, followed by Rwanda, $722, and Chad, $728, with Eritrea with $811. The other countries are a bit on the higher scale, but these had the lowest out of the 10 countries. We also bear witness to what happened with President Nkurunziza's of Burundi's attempt or introduction of the 3rd term in 2015. The wave of violence led to the death of thousands. In conservative estimates, over hundreds of casualties. We've also seen how 3rd term led to forced migration in Côte d'Ivoire in the last couple of months. The fear of election violence led at least 10,000 Ivorians to flee their country into Liberia, Ghana, Burkina, and Togo. But Liberia received the most of these refugees. The African Union and the regional economic communities have all attempted to effectively intervene in stemming totemism. But despite this attempt, there are such little to actually show for it. For instance, the effort of ECOWAS to introduce two-term maximum into the amendment of its supplementary protocol failed in 2015 during the summit based on the claim of state sovereignty. As we all know it at that point in time, the Gambia and Togo did not have term limits written into their constitution. So what role or what effect will it mean if the ECOWAS supplementary protocol introduces a two-term limit? Similarly, the AU Agenda 2063, a strategy to silence the gun by 20, it's become almost impossible to silence the gun in 2020. That is to rid Africa of wars and violent conflict. It remains unachievable if you have sit-tight rulers in place or the issue of sit-tight rulers are not addressed. And we will not also forget the fact that Article 25 of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Good Governance speaks to this issue, aside from the agreement from Lomé that tries to address the issue of unconstitutional change of government, which constitutional amendments is one of it. While the regional economic communities and the African Union have much to do in terms of solidifying democratic values on the continent, we have seen civic actors around the region have worked a lot in terms of strengthening constitutionalism and preventing third-termism. In Senegal in 2012, we had the local and regional civil society actors organized to prevent an Abdoulaye Wade third-term bid from being victorious. It never mattered if he was able to put it in the constitution, but what was important was that he was defeated in the polls. In 2014, in Burkina Faso, we had young people and creatives organized strategically, which housed long-term decoupling. Again, in coming together and using the power of hash civic strong role played ECOWAS and other partners. Jammeh was ousted. It is no longer fashionable to wield the gun to assume office, but it's actually okay currently to achieve the same purpose. As we say in Africa, and the clock, we have to start changing the rules, either constitution remains a coup d'etat. We speak to what we are years of engagement. From my years of engagement, leaders who cling to successful resistance to dictatorship. We also explore reasons for repeated cases of attempted and successful constitutionalized incumbents strategies that has actually worked against this attack to democracy. I will start by turning to my colleague, Sheikh Fall, to speak to his experience in terms of addressing issues of totemism in the West African region and, of course, Africa across the continent. Shekfal is one of the founders of Bring African activists and bloggers who use the internet to act for democracy. It brings together more than 150 people across the African continent. It has initiated an online participative democracy project to promote the transparency of countries' presidential elections through media coverage and citizens reporting. In 2014, it was nominated by Deutsche Welle for the best of online activism. Shekfal, I turn it on to you to speak to us. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour.
Thank you very much. Hello, good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you to NDI for inviting us to participate in this panel and this virtual conference on a topic that is of crucial importance and that we are so focused on, especially here in Africa. The theme of this panel is strengthening popular support for term limits, a retrospective on 2020. And this is a question that looks at the effectiveness of our actions and our efforts to prevent having third terms in Africa. Now, if I were to answer this question now, I would say that my answer would be somewhat mixed because I think that it's a somewhat pessimistic image, and there's perhaps not a lot of optimism to be found. There's a lot of negative responses. Perhaps there's more negative aspects than positive. So if I were to do a retrospective on 2020 in terms of presidential term limits, I would first of all cite the case of Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Benin. Now, the reason I name these countries is because in 2020, we saw that in these countries, their presidents established or tried to establish or apply strategies to officially validate their third term. Now, there were several methods that were used. First of all, we had a method where the president simply forced it, who imposed it. That was what we saw in the past. Now we see a more fluid methods where people try to amend the Constitution and to officially justify or validate an additional term. What we are seeing at the level of civil society is that we are starting to really question the pertinency and the relevancy of our strategies. And we are talking about how we can organize in order to better help the population and the citizens to continue moving forward on this and to help limit terms. But we're also wondering if we are really able to resist and stand up to these attempts to have a third term. So in response to this question, I would say overall, there's been a failure on the part of civil society, because we have not been able to prevent these presidents from amending constitutions, first of all, and then also we haven't prevented them from going to from being candidates for a third term and from winning these elections. So there's three levels at which we've failed. First of all, we failed at preventing the amendment, failed to preventing them from running again, and failed to prevent them from winning these elections. So if we had been able to prevent them from amending the constitutions, then we could talk about effective strategies. But if we look at how we were organized in 2020, citizens have been organized as advocacy groups and citizen movements on the internet. But what has the effect been? Let me talk about some of the consequences, the impacts, and the results of these movements. The consequences, from what I see for 2020, are that, first of all, there have been a larger number of deaths, people going to prison, people having to flee their countries, refugees, and go into political exile. Why? Because when citizens organize, And when we try to protest a third term, the only response that political authorities have is political or police repression, to go out and beat back the population, or prison, sending people to prison for the leaders of these movements and the people who are really raising their voices. And then also forcing people to go into political exile. We saw this in Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire with many activists. So those are the consequences. Now, what is the impact? What have been the impacts of these actions and these social movements working to fight against third terms? Well, the impacts is, first of all, a lack of results in terms of our strategies that civil society is using, because we haven't seen enough positive results. We've really only seen very negative fallout and negative results. So one of the impacts is that, and I'm not quite sure how to frame it, but I would call it non-presence or absence of international and sub-regional institutions such as ECOWAS, African Union, and other organizations such as African institutions promoting good governance and democracy. They really haven't been present enough in this issue. Now then, the results is that, and I think there's really only one result that really counts in 2020, and that is that many of these presidents have succeeded in obtaining a third term. So if you look at our strategy and the end results, I think that we have to say that it's a rather negative assessment in terms of our actions and activities. Having said that, I would now like to make a few proposals about how we could better address this in 2021. I think that in 2021, we need to start with, start by thinking about how we can resolve the issue of Republican and Democratic loyalty of our political authorities, and how we can solve this issue once and for all. When I talk about Republican loyalty and Democratic loyalty of leaders, that means when they come to power, they have to commit to only serving 2 terms and leaving office after their term is over. And we cannot have limits, presidential term limits, if they are not upheld, if they're not complied with. They can't be, there can't be repression if people try to apply these limits. And I think that the second proposal is we need to find mechanisms to force institutions and authorities to respect these commitments. Many have signed the African Charter on Democracy and Good Governance, but none of these states are really complying with the obligations under this charter. The third recommendation is that we need to encourage a national consensus and facilitate transparent and open transfer of power. Now, why do I talk about national consensus in a climate where in a climate where sharing power by political parties is a very difficult issue? And how can we resolve this issue of presidential term limits and motivate leaders to leave power peacefully when their term is over? When you look at the fact that in many countries, the salary of a former president isn't more than 1,000 euros. So we have to look at these mechanisms, and then we also have to defend and protect the principles of rule of law, constitutionalism, and upholding term limits. And civil society cannot do this alone. We need to have a mechanism that can make sure that regional and sub-regional institutions are capable of putting pressure on governments and insisting that authorities uphold and keep their commitments. our ancestors, our parents have fought for democratic change of power. And starting now, it's now our generation. It's up to our generation to continue this fight, to try to bring an end to this issue once and for all, the end of this issue of third terms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chair. So I'll turn to Ben. Ben Hinyabira is the program manager at Katiba Institute, an NGO that seeks to achieve social transformation through legal research, education, and public interest litigation. Ben holds a master's in philosophy in human rights and democratization in Africa from the University of Pretoria, South Africa, and a BA in economics and history from Egerton University. Ben, please, can you weigh in on the issue?
Thank you so much, Hassan, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm speaking from Nairobi, Kenya. Now, the topic of discussion today, which is about building popular support for term limits, 2020 in retrospect. So it's a topic that in a way contradicts some of the knowledge that we already have on the state or on the stand of Africans on the topic of discussion. For example, from yesterday's discussion, from the Afrobarometer survey, we've been told that in a survey that was done in 2015, in 34 countries in Africa, more than three-quarters, that is more than 75% of Africans support term limits. And one wonders if such a high percentage support term limits, why are we then even discussing this topic? Like it shouldn't be a problem in Africa. Another example in Kenya, for example, our president, the Kenyan president, President Uhuru Kenyatta, in the recent past has said that term limits is an issue in Kenya, referring to the fact that, according to him, we are done with the issue of term limits, and so we don't expect to have a problem of term limits in the coming days. And so that is the starting point. Like, why are we even discussing this topic? Yet, in many African countries, we seem to all agree that term limits is not an issue. I can see some comments saying I need to speak louder. I'm trying to do that. I suspect some of you cannot hear me clearly. Hassan? Okay.
Continue, please.
Thank you. So, that is the context within which we are discussing. So we have countries, so many countries in Africa interfering with term limits, and we have a situation where so many Africans support the idea of limitation of presidential term limits, for example. It can be beyond presidential term limits. So that is the problem that, as Katiba Institute, we have been trying to address since the meeting last year in Niamey. And another example that comes into mind, of course, is Rwanda, being potentially one of the 34 countries. And yet we know that a few years ago, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, they voted in a referendum to abolish term limits. And I think similar referendums, if they were held in many African countries, depending on who is pushing the agenda, there's a likelihood that many Africans may vote for such amendments in such a referendum. So the question is, why is that the case? And that is what, as Katiba Institute, we have been trying to answer. I shall talk about 4 points. The first one is the objectives that we had as Katiba Institute in the initiatives that we have conducted. Number two, I shall talk very briefly on the problem, what in our understanding is the current problem. And number three, it's about what we think can be done to address the problem. So the argument to addressing the problem, and finally, I shall give a small list of what we think are innovative approaches to addressing the problems. So the objectives, we had at least three objectives. So the first objective was we felt that we needed to first make people understand the context within which we are working. That's one. Two, so that the people even understand why we're discussing this topic. Why are we discussing presidential term limits and not any other thing? So the first thing is we started with first objective is to make sure that people understand the context of us discussing this topic. Number two is we had an objective of making sure that everybody understands the importance of presidential term limits. So at the end of our project, with our target audience, objective...
Tournons la page Congo. Tournons la page Congo.
Objective was to ensure that everybody understands...
Tournons la page Congo. Tournons la page Congo.
Number three, our third objective was about ensuring that members of the public have the capacity to advocate for term limits in their countries. So those three objectives are the ones that we set out as Katiba Institute to implement, and our focus was Kenya and Uganda, which is what we've been doing since December 2019.
Tournons la page Congo, le doyen de SOCIETE civile en Afrique de l'Ouest.
The problem, as we understood,
Tournons la page Congo, le doyen de SOCIETE civile en Afrique de l'Ouest.
I don't know, this is a voice that is disrupting in French. The problem, as we understood it, is that we have institutions in many of these African countries, if not all of them, including parliaments, including courts, that have a responsibility to ensure that the executives in these countries do not misuse their power and tamper with the presidential term limits. But then we realize that in many of these countries, these institutions of parliament, the courts, and in some cases, some independent institutions, they are not reliable. They tend to be manipulated in many of these countries. So if it's members of parliament, either they are, in the case of Uganda, for example, the allegations that members of parliament were given some little cash to support amendments to the constitution to remove presidential term limits. So in many of these countries, the allegations that parliaments, through members of parliament, and even courts, sometimes they are manipulated. And it's easy to see from the case in Uganda, where there were amendments to the constitution that the courts invalidated the amendments, and they did not invalidate the limit on the age limit without any good reason. So that is one. Then we realized that, so we have at least two options. The first option is to continue undertaking initiatives that can ensure that these institutions are more independent and they're able to do their job. So parliament and courts are made stronger and able to ensure that the executive is accountable. That's one. However, we know that these institutions are occupied by people that have interests. These interests will always remain. They can be given some cash and all that, bribed. So we felt that if we are to go to a more reliable approach, it is to go with the citizens, as the last defense to ensuring that presidential term limits, constitutional term limits are respected. So our focus then was primarily on citizens, because our focus was primarily on citizens because that's a reliable option. And in such initiatives, also ensure that the institutions that are responsible to ensure that the executive does not abuse its power, including changing presidential term limits, does not do so. So we ended up then with an argument in which we're saying that if leaders, especially the ones in the executive and political parties, particularly the ruling parties that tend to change presidential term limits, if such leaders know that any attempt to change term limits would not be accepted by citizens, they would not even attempt to change. They would not change, they would not even attempt to change. Okay, I've been asked to wait for 1 minute. Sorry. I think my voice has an issue.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ben. And while we take another person, please can you check your connection so that the volume can actually be very high and we can hear you properly when you make your next intervention. On that note, I'll introduce my sister that is on this panel, Felicia Antonio. Felicia works with Access Now as campaigner for the Keep It On campaign, a global campaign that fights against internet shutdown. Before joining Access Now, she was a program associate at the Media Foundation for West Africa, MFWA, where she coordinated the African Freedom of Expression Exchange, a continental network of free expression organizations in Africa. She's a 2019 fellow of the African Internet Governance School. She holds a master's degree in Letters Langues et Affaires Internationales from the University de Orleans, France, and holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in French and Psychology from the University of Ghana. Welcome, Felicia.
Thank you very much, Idaya. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, please.
Okay. It's really a great pleasure to be here today. And I'm wondering, somebody might be wondering what someone that focuses on internet shutdowns is doing on a panel on constitutional term limits. But I think the topic falls very much in line with the issues that we are discussing here. And so I will be focusing on how governments, including governments that have extended term limits or governments that have been in power for over 2 decades, as my co-panelists have already mentioned in their submissions, are resorting to the use of internet shutdowns to further stifle or violate human rights and to limit participation in democratic governance. And so you all agree with me that this year, 2020, has been a challenging one for everyone, of course, because of the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one thing that has been highlighted is the fact that the internet and digital communication tools are contributing significantly in containing the spread of the COVID-19 virus. How is this? Definitely, people are relying on the internet to continue work. And as was previously mentioned, last year we met physically for this conference, but we couldn't do that because of the pandemic. But thanks to the internet, here we are online, being able to continue the work that we do and to raise awareness about critical issues like the need for constitutional term limits, which is a key component of every democratic society. What I will do is that I will just talk about some of the trends we are seeing with regards to internet shutdowns in Africa, and then share some of the strategies that we've used as part of the Keep It On Coalition, which is a global network and which has also been in existence since 2016. And this could serve as some guidelines for organizations that want to strengthen advocacy with regards to constitutional term limits. And so the issue of internet shutdowns, as we recorded in 2019, we documented 25 incidents in Africa as compared to 17 that was recorded in 2018. Aside the fact that there was an increase in the number of shutdowns, there were countries that had not shut down the internet before, and that is 7 of them shut down the internet in 2019, but these countries did not or had not previously shut down the internet, including Benin, Gabon, Eritrea, Liberia, Malawi, Mauritania, and Zimbabwe. And so why is this relevant? A 2019 study by the Collaboration on International ICT Policy for East and Southern Africa, CIPESA as is popularly known, released a report noting that leaders that have been in power for more than 13 years as of January 2019 were identified as the major perpetrators of using internet shutdowns, mostly during national events like elections, anti-government protests, or coup attempts. And similarly, this year we have recorded incidents of internet shutdowns or social media blackouts in Togo, Burundi, Guinea, Tanzania, Chad, Sudan, a majority of which happened during elections. And Guinea was caught in the conversation with regard to term limits. There were a lot of human rights violations recorded during the elections and even during the referendum, as the civil society individuals rose up against the president's intention to reform the constitution in order to stand a third term. Not to say we couldn't stop that from happening. We did our best, but yet he went ahead to violate the interest of the people and serving a third term. And so internet shutdowns was used as one of the tools to suppress dissidents as well as the individuals that were protesting against this. And there were incidents of protesters that were killed during the elections and even prior to that. Over the past years, the Keep It On Coalition continues to raise awareness about the impact of internet shutdowns. And the struggle for a free and fair democracy requires efforts from all actors and individuals. And that is why for us at Access Now, our mandate is to defend and extend the digital rights of users at risk around the world. And in order to achieve this, we fight for the fundamental rights and freedoms of people, including freedom of expression, access to information, and freedom of assembly rights, and that are fundamental to the existence of everyone and a cornerstone in every democratic society. Some of the strategies we've used to engage in conversations with various stakeholders around the world include the assessment of elections, because we identified elections and protests as the key trigger points for governments using internet shutdowns. And as I already indicated, sorry, the government of Guinea did use internet shutdowns during a highly critical point that was elections, and that was, and we did record incidents of human rights abuses. And so we've identified elections as a key entry point where we can use to highlight the impact of internet shutdowns on people's lives and the economy as well. And also this continues to serve as a reminder to stakeholders such as governments and telcos of their duty to respect human rights by keeping the internet on. And this would enable transparency and active participation of citizens in the election processes. And these are key fundamental requirements for every democratic society. We also use documentation. And so this can be, I know a lot of organizations are already working on documenting incidents of governments refusing to step down when their term limits expire. And so this is a really important point to document these incidents. And for instance, we use documentation under the Keep It On campaign, where we have the shutdown optimization project. And under this project, we name and shame governments that use internet shutdowns to suppress its people. Documentation makes it evident for us to make our case before any other stakeholder that is supporting and promoting human rights on the globe. And then also we've used litigation to, I don't know how this will fit with regards to constitutional term limits, but when the people rise up and challenge their governments, the sad part is that they are able to manipulate the constitution to suit or to include unlimited term limits in it. But one thing that is important with regards to advocacy is that the list is not exhaustive. You get innovative from time to time to be able to engage the stakeholders. And so when the government changes their strategy in trying to govern people and violate the rights of the people, you also must become innovative in the strategies you employ. And so I would recommend the use of the legal recourse in order to settle, to challenge these governments that think that they have the right to stay in power, even when the people do not want them to be in power. And these are not the fundamentals of any democratic society. And to wrap up for this particular question, I would say that in the fight for a good cause, you must remain resilient. And a good campaign or advocacy isn't just one that yields results, but the one that remains focused and determined in order to bring about positive change and impact. And so it takes time to get results. That doesn't mean you are not doing well. You are really pushing hard. You are trying to engage the relevant actors, and some governments will not just listen to your cry, but be resilient and know that one day you would make the outcome, or that you achieve the outcome that you want to see in your country. So I will stop here for now, and then maybe in the subsequent discussion I would highlight other strategies that we use.
Thank you very much, Felicia, and thanks for injecting discussing. I'll be giving the floor to Monsieur Alim Tin. Monsieur Alim Tin is the founder of Africa Jom Center, a Senegalese think tank based in Dakar. Previously, he was the founding member and president of RADO and coordinator of the Forum of African NGOs at the World Conference Against Racism in 2000. He was also previously the regional director for West and Central Africa for Amnesty International, and currently is the independent expert of the United Nations on the situation of human rights in Mali. But what actually makes Monsieur Alim Tin very, very interesting and connected to this discussion is that Monsieur Alim Tin has been part of most of the engagement that has happened in terms of revolting or preventing totemism in West Africa. So Monsieur Tin was part of the Tanja Niger and President Tanja's attempt in Niger. He was also with regional civil society involved in Senegal, and recently led the West African civil society engagement to Guinea-Conakry to address the same issue. So Monsieur Tin will be speaking to us, but I want you, because he will be staying with us for a short period, to also add his highlight to tell us what exactly has changed between 2010 and 2020 in terms of our engagement as civil society in stemming this unconstitutional change in government. You are welcome, Monsieur Tin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What has changed between 2010 and 2020? There are two things that can be noted. First, a crisis of the rule of law, crisis of democracy, a crisis of universal suffrage that is becoming very clear today. What has also changed is the emergence of a citizen conscience among young people, a quite courageous group of young people that since 2012, with people like Myanmar, who have begun to develop work on what we call a new citizen awareness, a new citizen, and who participated in the resistance against the third term of the M23 that was put in place in 2012. And this was the first experience in which a world citizen engagement involving the political parties, civil society, and many other actors were able to make it such that the issue of a third term did not work through the vote, through the ballot box. That's very important to note in Senegal. What also changed is the mobilization of young people, such as what we call the Citizen Ballet in West Africa, which was able to end this life reign of President Blaise Compaoré. This was very difficult, but they managed to do so. And there was a new transition in Burkina Faso, which was difficult, which was able to or make it possible to have certain developments in Burkina Faso, especially a new constitution. And when you look at the elections, the differences that happened in the sub-region and the entire sub-region, we have elections that occurred with many confrontations, elections that happened with a lot of violence, a lot of instability, and lead to political impasses because of the forcing and the changes of the constitution, which is really political forcing in Guinea-Conakry, Cote d'Ivoire. And this all makes it such that today we are in a democracy of confrontation, which becomes clear in the civic space, and the fact that one is able to manifest for the constraints on demonstrating peacefully. Often the internet is cut off, and there has also been repression of dissidents. If you go to Guinea-Conakry today, since this experience has been more than 100 deaths, almost 200 people imprisoned, 85 people killed in Cote d'Ivoire, many in prison. If you also go today to Benin, it's the same situation. There are new constitutional modifications with a lot of pain. A lot of political parties are no longer able to participate in the elections. So we have a crisis of democracy, a crisis of the rule of law, but we might also need to come back to the deeper reasons for this crisis. And that is that today, there's a certain number of democratic conquests that are very deep-rooted, in which the great majority of the population see these as accomplishments and assets of democracy. That is term limits. It's very important. Also, they also consider that violating these term limits is almost a coup d'etat, and it's even worse than military coup d'etats. And this also comes from the fact that we are reproducing a certain number of examples or situations that we've inherited from colonialism. We have an issue of citizenship, but people are reaffirming their citizenship more and more. In the past, we saw citizenship as being lesser than. We were considered to be indigenous peoples. Now leaders tend to see people as surlan and don't respond to this need to fully participate in the public space.
Also, we see the phenomenon where the leadership in the style that was created by the colonizers too, with arbitrary power, absolute power, power without limits. Today, when you look at what is happening in many countries, despite the fact that there are constitutions that clearly define the rules and that clearly stipulate term limits and that clearly talk about separation of power, despite these constitutions, we still have a presidentialism, if you will, that profits and from the situation and holds all the power. The executive power is enormous. So this means that with respect to the Constitution, the head of state actually can do whatever he wants. And nobody can stop him, so it would seem. Neither the parliament nor the judicial branch. And that is a problem. It is a problem of institutions and of having well-regulated independent institutions. Today, we also need to examine the fact that there is a huge gap between this political culture and then these tendencies towards authoritarianism and this tendency to violate fundamental rights and the closing of civic space. With social media and the desire to develop these communication methods, the civil society wants to be able to express itself, but yet there's a huge gap between this fundamental liberty and what is actually being applied. And then also looking specifically at the youth, we see this as a huge problem of them not being able to express themselves. Now, what is important to look at is that we are also seeing that almost everywhere, whether it's in the French-speaking countries or the English-speaking countries, we are seeing the development of greater reflection about democracy and civic space. People are thinking about it more. I was at Gora yesterday, and people were talking about it, and we're seeing a lot more thought about strategies that we can develop in order to get out of this democracy of confrontation or confrontational democracy and move towards a better democracy. So what is important is that we cannot stop fighting. Africans need to continue this fight. And we must make sure that within civil society organizations, they are able to come together, to collaborate as networks. We need to enable them to come together, to work with other organizations, different organizations in different countries, to be able to create more powerful networks across the African continent to be able to fight this regression in terms of democracy. I think that this is extremely important. If there's a problem in Guinea-Conakry, for example, this is the problem. This should be the problem of every civil society organization and every activist. That's an important point. Also, this fight cannot be seen simply as a fight of advocates and civil society organizations. It must be seen as a fight that involves every single African citizen, whether you are a politician or not involved in politics, whether you're a non-state actor, a business person, or somebody from the private sector. We all need democracy that will guarantee security, stability, and guarantee peace. Because confrontational democracy in the Sahel context, where we have a lot of challenges, such as asymmetrical conflicts, if we do not pay attention and do not deal with this issue, we are going to see these conflicts spill out across the entire region. And we will see many countries threatened by these conflicts. So we need to have greater connections. We need to establish networks, have more organic unity amongst different civil society organizations. That's very important. And then also I would stress the need to think more about our strategies. How are we going to conduct this work? What can we do? What, for example, having documents and advocacy materials against third terms. If at African Union summits and within ECOWAS and other organizations, if civil society organizations are able to have counter summits as well in order to continue advocating and informing and conducting outreach, then we will have a more global resistance. And in all regions, we see this issue. So they need to work together, but it also needs to be done globally at the continental level. And anytime where we have a summit that brings together political decision makers and heads of state, we need to see civil society also working to continue advocacy efforts. And they need to be talking with everybody, not just people with the the opposition parties, but everybody, all the parties, all the decision makers. So we absolutely need to create greater solidarity at the regional level so that we can finally bring an end to this type of confrontational democracy that threatens peace and stability. And so that we can also start establishing the major principles that we need for a peaceful democracy and peaceful handover of power in our countries. So those are some of the main ideas that I wanted to throw out for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Ali and team. It's interesting listening to you and reflecting. And I think that's very critical what he has said. The absence of solidarity has been a challenge we have actually been grappling with, at least in West Africa, getting together civil society actors to even sign up to a letter. Again, during the Guinea-Conakry impasse was almost an Herculean task. The absence of a formidable network, the lack of solidarity amongst the group, and strategy, of course, really impacted our effectiveness at that point in time. I'll call on my colleague Bryce Makoso, the program coordinator of Tonon La Page, Congo. Since 1998, he has been the permanent secretary of the Justice and Peace Commission in Port-Noir, working principally on peace and reconstruction protests in Congo after the civil conflict of 1997 to 2000. Additionally, he is a member of the National Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, EITI Committee in Congo, Brazzaville. Bryce, please, you are welcome.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you can hear me clearly. It's a great pleasure for me to be participating in this panel today and on this virtual conference on presidential term limits after the discussions we had last year in the conference in Niamey last year. I, of course, will be talking about the issue of presidential term limits, which is a subject that we are all very focused on. I am from Congo, Brazzaville, and this is the country where I was born, where I live. And so we have seen always throughout history in our country, we have had a very difficult democratic process that started in the 1980s with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we saw that the winds of democracy blew across Eastern Europe and then came to Africa, Central Africa, and then to French-speaking Africa. And so we had hope at the time in the 1990s with the advent of multi-party politics and new constitutions and presidential term limits that were enshrined in these constitutions. However, very quickly after, in the 2000s, we saw the beginning of a change with these constitutions. For example, in Chad, Cameroon, Gabon, there were amendments made to the constitutions to change term limits or to include clauses in the constitution for unlimited terms for the president. So this movement that started in Central Africa was something that was not really followed closely at the time by the international community. And we saw this in many countries, Gabon, Cameroon, Chad, where the constitutions were modified to remove term limits. It was in 2012, 2013 then that Congo-Brazzaville, where our constitution did have term limits, and it was very clearly expressed that the president of the republic could not hold more than 2 terms of office. And when we saw that in the DRC and other countries where, for example, in Burundi, there was a bad interpretation of the Arusha Accords and the constitutions were either misinterpreted or changed to remove term limits, then we started to see this happen in our country as well. And we have been working at our organization, Tournons la Page. We have been organizing a citizen movement, movement of civil society, to try to advocate for term limits. And we have been working in many countries with this campaign, Tournons la Page, or Turn the Page, to try to promote term limits. And at the African level, I don't think we can talk about good governance or economic governance until we have good political governance in place. As long as political governance is weak, we cannot talk about good governance. Many African countries, especially in Central Africa, we see countries that are very rich in terms of natural resources with significant revenues, but we are seeing that the tendency is that whoever controls political power is also the person who controls the country's rich wealth and revenues from mineral resources, from forestry and oil revenues. And so this is a tendency that then allows leaders to leaders who keep power to continue controlling the natural resources and the wealth of the country. So we feel that we need to turn the page, hence the name Tournons la Page. The page that we need to turn is the page on these authoritarian regimes. We need to turn the page of these regimes that are not accountable, because we cannot move towards true development, even if we have the resources in our countries, as long as these political leaders are controlling them and the political regimes are not democratic. Our campaign, Tournons la Page, Turn the Page, was launched in 2014, October 2014, which is a symbolic date because that is when President Thomas Sankara was assassinated. And this campaign focuses on turning the page in Africa, and we feel that we can turn the page. For us, it's a matter of leading this campaign so that we can change the doctrine in Africa. Coup d'etats that we have seen starting in 2010, 2009, and thereon have been happening in silence in Cameroon and Chad and Gabon. And these coup d'etats that we are seeing are no longer military coup d'etats, they are actually institutional coup d'etats. And I think it was Aliantine who was talking about the situation and saying that in Côte d'Ivoire and Guinea, there are a lot of people who are being put into prison, political prisoners. So these institutional coup d'etats are just as bloody as military coup d'etats. We saw this in Côte d'Ivoire. There were people who died, and this wasn't a military coup d'etat. There were also deaths in Guinea and in Congo-Brazzaville when we tried to change the constitution in 2015. There were deaths at that time as well. In Burundi, there were deaths with their constitutional coup d'etat. And so the doctrine of coup d'etat in Africa must be changed. It has to be changed. We've seen in Mali that there was recently a coup d'etat that didn't produce any deaths, but everybody denounced this and wanted the military to leave power. And so we saw this coup d'etat in Mali, even though there weren't deaths, but we must change this doctrine of institutional and constitutional coup d'etats in Africa, which causes almost as many deaths as a military coup d'etat. We must also turn the page on a situation where our elections are sometimes just as bloody as a military coup d'etat. And of course, this is something that the African Union condemns in its charter and in all the instruments of governance produced by ECOWAS or the African Union or CIMAC. So our leaders have condemned military coups d'etats, but they just as easily validate constitutional coups d'etats or validate elections that are not fair and that produce catastrophic results in terms of our social and economic life. Tournons la page also wants to lead this campaign so to make it clear that we cannot have good governance as long as we have weak political governance in our countries. And this is true for countries in Africa, Central Africa, such as Gabon, Congo, Brazzaville, Guinea, Chad. These are countries that are really at the heart of Central Africa and part of the Lake Chad Basin and forests, which are rich areas in natural resources, but countries that are, of course, very poor in terms of their populations because of bad political governance and weak governance. Our organization, Tournons la Page, would also like to, or is also leading this campaign to highlight what we call the diplomacy of interests and to really highlight the diplomacy of principles. We see very clearly today that sometimes in the name of oil contracts or mining contracts, people close their eyes to lack of democracy or lack of governance because they don't want to criticize the president of a rich country, a president who holds all the natural resources, whereas, in fact, these natural resources belong to the people, to the citizens, and they do not belong to the president of the republic. We are also today seeing that more and more there are actors in Africa, economic Africas, working in Africa, and also in other emerging countries that are coming to set up shop in Africa. And so in the end, traditional democracy, which had been intransigent in terms of human rights, is now becoming a little less intransigent in terms of upholding human rights and democracy. So since we don't have much more time, I will simply sum up by saying that what we are trying to do is to have a catalyst, a political catalyst and change, mobilize citizens so that they can be better able to talk about these issues. Because in all constitutions, of course, we talk about popular sovereignty, saying that human beings are sacred, that human life is sacred. But curiously, in our countries, all these military coups d'etats and constitutional coups d'etats have killed humans and completely trampled on human rights. And so even though the principle of respect for human life is sacred in our constitutions. So we are also trying to highlight the role of popular sovereignty and respecting the voice of the people. This is something we are trying to do, mobilize citizens so that they can defend their rights, their freedoms, and have peaceful transfer of power in Africa, democratic handover of power. And this, of course, is at the very heart of our Tournons la Page, or Turn the Page campaign, because we feel, again, as I said, we cannot have democracy if we do not have peaceful transfer of power in Africa. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bryce. We've learned a lot listening to all the panelists. We have very little time. So I'll ask the panelists to be very snappy in terms of addressing the issues we have been able to collate from the audience, and also come up with recommendation on how we move forward from here. My first question will actually go to Sheikh. Importantly, what are the challenges and opportunities we have in terms of engaging young people and other underrepresented groups in politics? And in particular, considering the fact that AfriVista uses internet a lot, how do you address the issue of disinformation during your campaigns? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Young people are often the group that we're really asking to make a lot of efforts. Now we're asking them to be more involved, to help change things. And I think that youth are doing this and have been for quite some time. But what we're seeing, for example, in Tunisia, what happened in Burkina Faso in 2014, or even in the Maghreb, or what we saw in Senegal in 2012, and also what's happening, even if it hasn't been successful in Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire, we're also seeing, though, that young people are really initiating these social movements. And now, of course, the internet is a wonderful tool that is allowing youth to have a voice. And of course, this is helping us to increase what we would call citizenship or civic duty. So we need to continue equipping African youth so that they can be more aware of their civic duties, their role and responsibilities as citizens, so they can help deal with these issues of lack of human rights or electoral crises and all these institutional issues. So we have to start at the grassroots level to deal with all these issues. We have to start building what we would call model citizens, people who are really aware of democracy, and citizens who have a different relationship with the homeland or with the government or with their country, a new relationship. And this concept is that we need to have a break. We need to break with the past, sort of a divorce. We need to divorce our institutions and have a new relationship. We need to ask African youth what they really think politics is, or what the president should be, or even the word of the president, what that should represent. And we need to really motivate them to try to bring about these changes. And that's the trend we need to encourage. We need to have a reconciliation with our institutions. And we also have to have a greater presence of the state. In order to have this presence of the state, as everybody's been saying, we need to have more accountability with our institutions and also strong engagement to uphold democracy. In terms of disinformation on the internet, this is not just a problem with the youth, of course. We have all kinds of audiences on the internet. You've got organizations, media, you've got the youth, but fake news today, if we see young people, when we talk about fake news, it's a way to deform reality. And we see that these are sometimes organizations, institutions, even societies that have the means to publish this information. And sometimes this fake news is put out there to try to change citizens' ideas, to manipulate public opinion, to manipulate their ideas. And so people that have these financial means to do this, these are often the ones who are fabricating these fake news. But this is not an element that really should have an impact on democracy. It's not necessarily a phenomenon that's irreversible. This is something, of course, that we can change, and that comes through training and education and greater outreach.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm going to pose the same question to Professor Alimtin and Bryce to please help us answer this very important, two very important questions. So what is next for countries where presidential limits have already been extended or removed? What can we do in terms of strategies, in terms of addressing of reintroducing the democratic value of regular transitions of power? Yeah, so that's my first question. Then can you give us at least 2-3 strategies, if not one, that has been effective so far that we can actually adopt in terms of stemming this unconstitutional change in government? Bryce, then after Bryce.
I'm sorry, I had a few connection issues. Could you repeat the question? I didn't catch it, please. I didn't hear you. Your mic was cut off. Could you repeat the question, please? I had an internet connection issue.
Okay, thank you very much. I guess it's network issues. So what is next? Some of the countries already have their presidential term limit extended or removed. So what can we do in terms of reintroducing the democratic value of regular transition of power? Can you also reflect on strategies that have worked and that we can actually adopt in terms of stemming this unconstitutional change in government?
Yes. May I say something? Go ahead, Bryce. Thank you, Arion. I think that today, more and more, what we are seeing is that in Africa, and I don't know if it's Sheikh who was saying this, but we're seeing more and more social movements coming into being in Africa that are mobilizing our young people. What we are doing right now with our campaign, Turn the Page, is to focus on mobilizing citizen movements. The idea of citizenship has been basically destroyed by our politics, by intimidation, fear, repression. Citizens are disinterested, disengaged, and do not really participate in politics and the management of public affairs. So we need to recreate this idea of active citizenship so that our citizens will be able to truly participate in managing the public affairs, and so that citizens can also help decide, make decisions on issues that impact their lives. And unfortunately, everything that's been done up until now has been done to show citizens that their voice doesn't count, that their opinion doesn't count. So we need to make sure that citizens can be able to take ownership of politics and be able to be more involved in politics and political life. So this is what we're trying to do with our campaign. Also, we are working on this basic issue of sacred human rights. More and more, we're seeing that human life has no meaning. It isn't sacred anymore. And that's why we're seeing these demonstrations that are repressed, or we see violence against these movements. And so with our campaign, we have some of our colleagues who have been thrown into prison in Niger. A lot of them have been thrown into prison for quite some time. Some of them were in prison for a very long time. And that's why Tournons la Page is trying to educate citizens. And when we see that citizens are engaged, we are trying to make sure that they're not thrown into prison, that they're not forced into exile or suffer from repression. So this is what we are trying to do right now in order to make sure that citizens can be more involved in terms of this issue of democratic handover of power. And this is something that has to be on the political agenda of both political authorities or leaders and citizens.
From my point of view, to face situations in which term limits are upheld or are not upheld, indeed, I think, first of all, you need to have requirements that make it possible for fundamental freedoms and rights to work, such that everyone who's in jail be freed. Make this a condition of the national dialogue, because everyone wants a national dialogue. Everyone needs to get to be let out of prison. This is very important. If there are people who are exiled, they need to come back. But I think that the most important matter is that when leaders are resisting change, also when Ivorians and citizens are resisting, when Congolese are resisting, that they not feel alone, they not feel isolated in their fight. And that indeed, if repression occurs, such as what was described earlier today, the right to life has been discarded, is being seen as irrelevant. And so we need regionally to have solidarity, but also we need international solidarity. That's very important. What made these fights have resonance with the international media, with international solidarity? Everyone who believes in fundamental freedom, human rights, these people need to express themselves. Nations need to speak out. There was a time when there were violations of human rights. There were communiques from the European Union. That no longer happens. Also from the State Department. That no longer happens. So when you have a tyrant who is oppressing his people and people, when people fight and no one talks about it, human rights violations are not compatible with silence and indifference. That's very important to emphasize. The other issue that I would like to point out is that leaders need to know that the state of persons and individuals is not something that can be separated from the state of society or of the government. If you have individuals who are well, who are flourishing, then you have a state that's flourishing. These two things cannot be dissociated. The well-being of the individual needs to correspond and match the well-being of the state. And if you make the citizen vulnerable, you make the nation and the government vulnerable. This is inevitable. So you need to have a balance and have it such that that balance of power exists. And that requires a fight. For a fight, you need solidarity at the national level, at the regional level, and have international solidarity. That is extremely important. But when you fight and you're alone and there's no resonance, most tyrants feel boosted by this. Guineans must not be alone. Ivorians must not be alone in their battle. All Africans need to be by their sides, and the international community needs to be with them, especially when the values and principles that are being defended are those that are stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Thank you very much, Professor Aline. We still have 2 more questions, so I'm just going to throw the questions to Bryce and to Philippe.
You also mentioned a case where there was a success. I think that what we did in Senegal in 2012, between 2011 and 2012, was a strategy that succeeded. Why? Because it brought together almost all sectors of society. It was a citizen fight that brought together civil society, political parties, and involved all segments of society. Number one. Number two, there was the work of advocacy that was done regionally and internationally. And the elections had been observed in Senegal. That was international. Everyone was present. NDI, State Department, European Union, also the African Union and ECOWAS. This is also something that needs to be repeated. But now you see no one goes to the elections. People are alone. And it succeeded because of national, regional, international solidarity.
Thank you very much. Ben and Felicia, we have two very important questions here to line follow. One, which is very important, is that why do presidents want to be president for life? Why do they want to keep being in office after their tenure has actually expired? What's the thinking? What are our findings? Secondly, and very importantly, is that do we think that it's okay for young people to vote for anybody just to participate in elections? So I'll start with Ben. I hope your internet and your mic is working better, please. Then go on to Felicia.
Thanks, Hassan. I hope you can hear me better now.
Perfect.
Thank you. About the first question, and I could note that I didn't finish a point in my previous presentation. I could say one point last that is not part of the two questions. But on the first question, which is about why leaders would want to be in power for too long, I'm not sure if it's a difficult question, because I think power is sweet, I think. And so because power is sweet, they want to be in power for long. And that's why they need to be limited. That's why we need to limit power. So I am not sure if there are many ways of answering that question. My answer would be power is good, and because it's good, it comes with privileges. They therefore would like to be in power for long. So that's one. Two, on the second question on whether it's right for young people to vote for whichever person they want in an election, I think it's a process. It's a process of building democracies. And all these people, young people, old, elderly people, if they have the right to vote, and we should let them vote in whichever person they want. The question is, do they always make rational decisions? They probably don't. And that is where the problem is. It may depend on who defines rationality. But in the case of voting for someone for too long, for example, voting for someone for 30 years, 40 years, same people, that can be a problem. But then the question is, why do they keep doing that? And I would connect that to the point that I wanted to say, that they tend to have reasons which I think can be rational from their perspective. For example, when we talk to young people about the need for term limits, some of them say, why do we need to have term limits? We can just have elections. Elections can determine the issue of term limits. Like, people are able to make decisions and decide if they want leaders to stay for long or not. And so, but then when you give them counter arguments, like sometimes the incumbents have advantage during elections, or for example, when you argue that, what argument do we give for elections? Maybe it's because leaders can manipulate elections, because because they're incumbents in the same stream of argument. So when you give them, for example, those two arguments, then they agree and say, yeah, true, we need to limit their power because they have these advantages, and so elections may not all the time give fair results. And another reason they tend to give is about, what about those good leaders? If someone has performed well, they should be given more time. But then again, when you counter-argue and say that, yeah, but then not the only good leaders, there can be other good leaders. And sometimes when you tell them that maybe others could come with new good ideas, again, they tend to agree with you. So I think on the whole point, and of course, the third and last example I would give is some of them talk about other countries and say, look at Germany. Their chancellor has been in power for so long. Look at Britain. Margaret Thatcher was in power for 11, 12 years. And what about those countries? But then again, when you tell them, you see, they have a parliamentary system. In such systems, it's easy to remove their leaders. And in presidential systems, that's not the case. And other arguments about more developed electoral systems, then they tend to agree. So I think young people and old people are generally rational in the decisions they make from their perspective. We probably need to give them more information so that their rationality is more informed. And that is what we are trying to do at Katiba Institute by developing more knowledge materials that are informing people to make rational decisions. And if they understand the importance, they are not easily swayed. Thank you.
Yes, and to add on, I do agree with Ben. And definitely power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so if there's a president in power and he has the privileges to do whatever he wants with the country's resources and amass the kind of wealth that is favorable to him, yet a majority of the population are wallowing in poverty and wallowing in poverty, then it means that that president, if not checked, would remain in power to enjoy these privileges. So that is the reason why I think governments that don't want to step down continue to use all kinds of tactics to stay in power to enjoy these privileges. With regards to the youth, I think that it's, for me, just imagine a young person in a country where he or she has known just one president for over 30 years. He doesn't have any other narrative to compare to. And so that is why it's important for us to change that narrative, to let them understand that democracy is not how much time or how many years somebody spends being a president or a leader, but then it's your ability to also contribute in making decisions, in contributing to discussions that affect you as a citizen, and not just because the person has been in power for so many years. Maybe he even took the power from his father or his grandfather. It is a democracy and not a monarchy, if I would say. And so it's important for us to really educate the youth, sensitize them to understand that they have a role to play in promoting good governance, in advancing democracy in their country and even in other countries. And so that is what I would say with regards to the youth being actively involved in politics. Fair enough, everybody has the right to choose whoever he or she wants to vote for, but then civil society, we have a very important role to play to let people understand the importance of diversity in every democratic society. So that is what I would say in response to these questions.
Thank you very much. I'd like to wrap up. It's been a very interesting conversation. I think I've learned a lot personally, quite illuminating and broad. And I think that at the end of the day, we have actually agreed that we have before us a crisis of democracy. that gradually there is an absence of the rule of law, there is flagrant disregard for fundamental human rights, that the civic space is becoming more constricted with each passing day, and violence is now rife, especially when leaders are trying to perpetrate their unconstitutional change in government. That if this totemism or attempt to amend or change the constitution to elongate states stay in office is not nipped in the bud, there might actually be a regression in what we have been experiencing of late. And we hope this new wave will not spread across the continent. But again, be that as it may, we saw that there are also positives. And some of the positives we have actually identified is the role young people are playing on the continent. The important role, again, that social media and the internet in particular is playing. And that is why we could see that attempts in Chad, in Guinea, Conakry, for instance, there was internet clamped down, and even a change in the number of countries that have actually clamped down or shut down the internet in their attempt to sustain themselves in office. So the internet, young people, social movements are positive trend that we can build upon. But again, there are some issues that are positive, but they can actually be negative. So we really have to strategize in terms of benefiting from some of these. That is, how do we bolster the roles of youth? That elections are still very, very important, and the quality of elections will actually add to participation and the ability of people to keep themselves in office. Senegal is a very good example. Yes, it was able to force through a constitutional amendment, but it was actually defeated. Abdoulaye Wade was defeated through the ballot box. That we have to strengthen the civic space as very, very important for us. And the role multilateralism is played in the future. How do we bring it back where the world becomes a global village? America can continue to be Uncle Sam will be the police of the world, and leaders here in Africa will fear when they think of the statements that is actually coming out from France, Germany, and the United States of America. That for us as civic actors, one thing is very, very key. There is a need to build solidarity more and more. Having a very active network do really help in terms of our engagement. And when we strategize again, our advocacy should not just be on a regional level or on the continental level. We have to widen our spectrum to ensure that we advocate at the international level and broadly and expansively define what civil society means, not just to be people like myself and my colleagues that are on board speaking today, but to ensure that they include the citizens who matters the most in what we do. So thank you very much. I'm sure that the organizers will want to come in to say another big thank you to all our viewers and participants. Thank you.